Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to really get under the skin of the big stories, pull them apart, and see what's really going on.
Absolutely.
And today, we've got a big one. A really surprising announcement, actually. A declaration of peace, if you can believe it, in a part of the world often just, well, defined by conflict.
It is pretty remarkable on the surface, isn't it? We're talking about that statement from former U.S. President Donald Trump. Came out on June 23rd, 2025.
Right.
And he announced a ceasefire agreement, purportedly, between Iran and Israel, which, given the history there, the decades of tension, it sounds almost unreal.
It really does. So our mission today for this deep dive is to carefully unpack this, like layer by layer. What exactly did he say? How did people react?
And maybe the biggest question, who actually wins here or loses? What does this sudden peace or apparent peace mean for the whole region? The Middle East is just so volatile.
Exactly. We want to cut through those instant headlines, look at the currents underneath, maybe some hidden motivations, and give you, our listener, a really solid, informed take on this, especially if you're maybe newer to the complexities of international relations. It's a tangled web.
It certainly is.
Okay, so let's set the scene. How did this all break? The date, we said, June 23rd, 2025. The first word came from Trump. When was it? Just after lunch.
Yeah, the first statement was logged at 12:52 p.m. And his opening shot was quite something. He described Iran's retaliation against the U.S. as, his words, very weak.
Okay, very weak. But let's get the context. This was Iran supposedly hitting back because the U.S. had just allegedly destroyed 3 of their nuclear facilities, right?
That's the preceding event, yes. And the U.S. action was reportedly massive. We're talking 125 fighter jets, 7 B-2 bombers. I mean, that sounds like a huge operation, a very decisive strike.
So a major U.S. strike, followed by a very weak Iranian response. What did that response actually look like, according to the source material?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, and frankly, central to the source's whole interpretation. Iran apparently launched 14 missiles. Just 14.
14, okay.
And get this, 13 of them were intercepted.
Okay.
Shot down. The one that got through, it just went off course. Caused no harm.
So 0 U.S. casualties, almost no damage.
Exactly. No casualties, almost 0 damage. And Trump's spin on this was fascinating. He said Iran had, quote, cleaned out all these emotions from their revenge system.
Cleaned out emotion?
Yeah, like it was some kind of necessary venting. He even said he hoped it signaled an end to the hatred.
Yeah.
It frames the whole thing less as a serious military comeback and more like a symbolic gesture, a way to save face, maybe.
But here's the bit that really makes you scratch your head. Trump claimed, didn't he, that Iran actually told them beforehand?
He did, explicitly. Claimed Iran notified us in advance about the timing, even the method of their strike. And he said that pre-warning was exactly why the U.S. could avoid casualties and damage.
Yeah.
Which sounds, well, incredibly convenient. Almost too cooperative for sworn enemies, wouldn't you say?
It sounds downright bizarre. Like, hey, we're about to retaliate for that massive bombing run. Just wanted to give you a heads up.
Precisely. And this is exactly where the source material goes deeper. It suggests this whole sequence wasn't just tit for tat, it's more like implied performance art.
Performance art.
Or a double act.
Yeah.
Carefully choreographed. The source suggests that Trump himself, using back channels, quiet diplomacy, maybe third parties, had already told Iran that the initial U.S. strike, the one on the nuclear sites, was going to be symbolic, designed not to cause real escalation. Just a show of force.
Okay, so the U.S. strike was maybe prearranged to be limited.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
And Iran, understanding this signal, played along. They reciprocated by notifying Trump about their counterattack, also ensuring it was symbolic, manageable.
So it wasn't a real fight, but like a staged fight to let everyone claim they did something without starting World War III.
Kind of like that, yeah. The source uses the phrase shared eye contact, a mutual understanding to de-escalate things quietly while looking tough publicly. Both sides basically reading from the same script.
That's quite a theory.
It is. And according to this view, that whole managed exchange, that performance, perfectly set the stage for Trump's next big announcement, the ceasefire itself.
Right, which came pretty quickly after that first statement, just over 2 hours later.
Yep, 3:02 p.m. sharp. And that's when he announced it. Israel and Iran have agreed to a full ceasefire.
A full ceasefire. But the details he gave, they weren't simple, were they? The timeline sounded almost deliberately confusing.
Oh, absolutely. It was quite convoluted. First, he said Israel and Iran had 6 hours. 6 hours to complete their final missions.
Final missions.
Yeah.
Keep fighting for 6 more hours.
It implies that, yes, Like they need to get a few last shots in, tie up loose ends before stopping. A strange way to start a ceasefire.
Okay, so 6 hours of final missions. Then what?
Then, after those 6 hours, the war would be considered over. But they wouldn't stop firing at the same time. Iran would cease fire first, formally.
Goes first.
Then Israel would wait for 12 hours. 12 hours after Iran stopped, then Israel would cease fire.
12 hours later. Why the delay?
Good question. The announcement didn't really explain the logic. And then, wait, there's more. 24 hours after Israel finally stopped firing.
Another day.
Another full day later, then the world would mark the official end of the 12-day war.
Okay, hold on. 6 hours, then Iran stops, then 12 hours later Israel stops, then 24 hours later it's officially over. That sounds messy.
It is mathematically messy. The source points this out too. If you try to add it up, 6 plus 12 plus 24, it doesn't quite make sense chronologically depending on how you interpret the start and end points. It feels more like narrative staging than practical instruction.
Yeah, it feels symbolic again, like the timing itself is part of the message.
Perhaps. Or maybe just poorly explained. But Trump wrapped it up by congratulating both sides for their wisdom. Said they ended a conflict that could have lasted for years and destroyed the entire Middle East, which, raises the stakes considerably. And then he ended with blessings for everyone involved.
The 12-day war, that label itself is significant, isn't it? Framing it as short, contained.
Absolutely. Calling it the 12-day war right away emphasizes how brief it was, especially compared to the potential catastrophe everyone feared. A wider regional war, dragging in neighbors, maybe even global powers. It suggests the short duration itself was the victory here, preventing the big one.
Regardless of how confusing the actual stop-start timeline was.
Exactly. The headline was, it's over, and it was short. That seems to be the main point.
Okay, so we have this announcement, the ceasefire, this whole strange performance art theory. It just makes you ask, what did everyone really want here? What were the underlying motives? Let's start with Iran. What does the source say about their actual intentions? Did they want this fight?
Well, according to the source material, the answer is a pretty resounding no. It states very bluntly that Iran doesn't want to fight. And it goes further, saying Iran has been essentially cowering through the whole thing.
Cowering? That's strong language. Why would they be cowering?
The source implies it's a mix of things. Decades of sanctions have hit their economy, their military.
Yeah.
They might have internal unrest to worry about. A big war is hugely risky for the regime's stability. Plus, historically, they often prefer using proxies, regional allies, rather than getting into a direct slugfest with the U.S. or Israel. It conserves their strength.
And leadership, Khamenei.
The source points to his age. He's 85. And it claims he has no intention of fighting. His goal is apparently just to cope with the situation, manage it, ride it out, but avoid a full-blown war that could, destroy everything.
So it's about survival. Saving face while avoiding actual disaster.
That's the picture painted. Saving face is important, but avoiding a catastrophic conflict is paramount. The source uses this analogy comparing Iran's stance to a character named Fan Debiao from some Chinese comedy.
Fan Debiao. Okay.
Apparently this character acts really tough, talks a big game, but always finds a way to duck out of a real fight. It's all bluster. So the source sees Iran doing the same, projecting strength, making the necessary retaliatory noises, but cleverly sidestepping a genuine, devastating war. It's presented as a kind of weary pragmatism.
Okay, so Iran wants out. What about Trump? The source suggests he wanted de-escalation too, but for different reasons, more businesslike.
Exactly. He's characterized fundamentally as a businessman. And from that perspective, war is bad business. It's losing money, plain and simple.
Right.
So he definitely didn't want the U.S. getting trapped in another quagmire. He explicitly worried about another Afghanistan situation.
It cost trillions.
Trillions.
Yeah.
And he feared it could trigger what the source says he called a triple kill.
A triple kill? What's that?
A simultaneous crash of the U.S. dollar, U.S. government bonds, and the stock market. War drains resources, forces borrowing, spooks investors. It could be economically catastrophic from his viewpoint.
So avoiding that was a huge motivation.
Huge. And we saw the markets react immediately when the de-escalation happened. Oil prices dropped true and went below $70 a barrel. That's a big sign of relief.
The stock market got a little boost too.
And there were geopolitical angles too, right?
Yeah.
For Russia.
Definitely. Preventing oil prices from spiking avoids handing a financial lifeline to Russia, helping them fund their war in Ukraine. So for Trump, Backing away from this conflict hit multiple goals: economic stability at home, avoiding a costly foreign entanglement, and not inadvertently helping geopolitical rivals. It made sense from his perspective.
Okay, so Iran wants out, Trump wants out. Which brings us to the really explosive claim in the source material: Israel. The source seems to pinpoint Israel, specifically Netanyahu, as the one party that did want the conflict to continue.
Yes, this is where the source gets extremely critical. It puts forth this provocative idea: only one person, or one country, Israel wants to fight, and it names Netanyahu directly.
And what are his alleged goals, according to this source?
The claim is quite stark: capture more land and eliminate all potential opposing forces in the Middle East. So it's framed not just as self-defense, but as active expansionism and seeking regional dominance.
Wow. That's a heavy accusation.
It is. And the source goes further, alleging the war was instigated entirely by Israel. It claims Netanyahu deliberately provoked groups like Hamas, then pretended to be surprised by the reaction.
To create a pretext.
Exactly. A pretext for cleansing operations, as the source puts it, and for seizing land. It lists examples, actions, or ambitions in Lebanon, against the Houthis, in Iraq, securing the Golan Heights. It portrays a pattern.
A pattern of using conflict as a tool for expansion.
That's the explicit claim made by the source. The conflict isn't just reactive, it's a proactive strategy for achieving larger territorial and strategic goals across the Middle East.
Okay, so if we accept that premise, just for the sake of argument, following the source's logic, then that big U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear sites looks very different. Not like escalation, but something else.
Precisely. The source interprets the U.S. strike in a very cynical, strategic way. It calls it a calculated gift to Netanyahu.
A gift? How so?
The thinking is, by symbolically taking out Iran's nuclear facilities or claiming to Trump, essentially removed Netanyahu's main public reason for continuing a war against Iran. If the big threat was an Iranian bomb and the U.S. dealt with that threat,
then the justification for more fighting evaporates.
It gets much harder to sell internationally, yes. It pulls the rug out from under that primary pretext for a wider conflict with Iran.
And the source doesn't even seem convinced Iran actually had nukes ready to go.
No. It expresses deep skepticism. It draws parallels to past claims like WMD's in Iraq or Libya's program. The source argues, controversially, that countries with actual nuclear weapons like Russia or China or North Korea don't get attacked for having them. It's the ones accused of trying to get them that become targets.
Suggesting the nuclear threat itself can be a convenient excuse.
That's the source's implication, that it's a narrative used to justify action, not necessarily the core driver.
Yeah.
So that whole U.S.-Iran back and forth, the symbolic strike, the symbolic retaliation, is framed as pure performance art.
Okay.
And its main goal, according to the source, not just de-escalation in general, but specifically to give Netanyahu an explanation, a diplomatic way out. And then there's this other very controversial claim.
Yeah.
The source suggests it was also done to satisfy certain powerful interest groups, which it labels very problematically as Jewish bosses. Now, we need to be crystal clear. This is the source's highly contentious language, not ours. We're reporting it impartially.
Understood. It's reporting the source's claim, not endorsing the terminology.
Exactly. But the implication from this perspective is that this whole elaborate setup allowed for a temporary halt, created the appearance of solving the immediate crisis, but didn't actually touch the deeper ambitions the source attributes to Netanyahu and others. The core drivers of conflict remain, just paused.
Right. It really paints a picture of layers upon layers of strategy and, well, cynicism. So let's zoom out a bit. Regional stability. What were the immediate concrete effects of this ceasefire announcement? You mentioned the markets liked it.
They definitely did. That drop in oil prices below $70 a barrel was significant. It showed immediate relief in a key global market. And the positive bump in U.S. stocks, even if slight, reflected that same feeling from the financial world. A major risk seemed to be off the table, at least for now.
And for the U.S. itself, strategically.
It was seen as a win. Avoiding getting sucked into another potentially long, very expensive war in the Middle East frees up resources, political energy, and as we touched on, it avoids indirectly helping rivals like Russia through higher oil prices.
Yeah.
So yeah, on the surface, calming things down looked good for U.S. interests financially and geopolitically.
But there's always a but, isn't there? That the source talks about these unstoppable forces that make lasting peace really difficult. What are they referring to?
This is where the source's optimism, if there ever was any, really fades. It acknowledges Trump probably did want peace, wanted to end these conflicts quickly, both Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Iran.
Okay.
But then it introduces this metaphor. The two grandmas you can't offend.
Two grandmas. Who are they?
It's a somewhat disrespectful way of referring to Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu. The source claims, quite provocatively, that neither of them treat Trump like a human, meaning they essentially ignore his calls for peace and just pursue their own agendas.
So powerful leaders who won't listen to outside calls for moderation.
That's the idea. They operate based on their own calculations, their own perceived national or personal interests, regardless of what Washington wants.
And the source sees these two conflicts differently, Russia-Ukraine versus Israel-Iran.
Yes, it draws a contrast. In the Russia-Ukraine war, it portrays both sides, Putin and Zelensky, as disobedient, both hindering peace efforts. It gives an example, maybe questionable, of Zelensky allegedly bombing Russian assets right before talks were supposed to happen. The point being, both sides are seen as difficult.
Okay, two sides making peace hard there. What about Israel-Iran?
Here, the contrast is stark. Iran's leader, Khamenei, is described as old and steady, even cooperative and cowering, willing to go along with de-escalation.
So in the Middle East context, Iran is seen as the more compliant party in this specific scenario.
According to this source, yes, which leads directly to the conclusion that if peace is being blocked, the obstacle isn't coming from Tehran in this instance.
Which puts the spotlight squarely back on Netanyahu. The source calls him the grandma who won't stop, implying he's the main obstacle.
That's exactly the assertion. The source strongly suggests his political survival depends on the war continuing. The rally around the flag effect conflict distracts from domestic problems.
And there were domestic problems before this flared up, right? Big protests.
Huge protests. The source mentions 100,000 people protesting monthly for 8 months straight before the conflict kicked off. That's serious opposition. And then comes the really controversial claim that Netanyahu might have deliberately allowed initial attacks to happen or failed to prevent them adequately.
To create the justification for the war he needed.
That's the deeply cynical suggestion made by the source, that the crisis was, if not manufactured, then certainly exploited for political gain and to pursue a broader agenda.
And the source is pretty blunt about what should happen if the war does end.
Extremely blunt. Uses terms like Netanyahu should be liquidated, held accountable, stepped down. Very strong language, suggesting a desire for a complete removal from power and a reckoning.
Because his alleged ultimate goal isn't peace, but,
according to the source, to open up territory, to build a great historical legacy through conquest, through expansion. And obviously that kind of ambition just doesn't align with stopping the fighting. It requires more conflict, not less.
So, if Netanyahu has these alleged ambitions, how does Trump try to counter him, according to this source? And does the source think it will work?
Where Trump is portrayed as being quite shrewd here, playing cunning, as the source puts it. His big move was that symbolic strike on Iran's nuclear sites.
Right, the gift.
Exactly. By doing that, he took away Netanyahu's main public excuse, the nuclear pretext, for a wider war with Iran. It was a clever way to rhetorically disarm him, at least on the international stage.
But does the source think Netanyahu will actually buy it? Will he stop?
Deep skepticism on that front. The source says it's highly doubtful he'll just accept this and cease hostilities for good, especially with figures like Ben-Gvir and his government.
Who is seen as even more hardline.
Yes. Ben-Gvir is portrayed as deeply committed to an expansionist vision. His influence makes a genuine, lasting peace seem much less likely from the source's perspective.
So the overall outlook is still pretty pessimistic.
Relatively speaking, yes. The source concludes the Israel-Iran situation is still very problematic. Maybe it says a bit better than Russia-Ukraine, because here only one side is fooling around, meaning Netanyahu's alleged agenda, whereas in Ukraine it implies both sides are messing things up. But still, one side being committed to conflict, according to this view, is more than enough to prevent real peace.
Okay, this next part delves into something really, really out there, and I want to stress again for everyone listening. The source itself flags this as an unverified rumor. It apparently comes from a Korean source, talking about an Israeli soldier's badge.
Yes, it's presented very much as grapevine news, something heard but not confirmed. But the source clearly thinks it's significant enough to discuss because it points towards a potential long-term motive. It's about a map supposedly depicted on this badge, a map of Greater Israel.
Greater Israel. What does that actually entail, according to this rumor?
Well, the scale described is just mind-boggling. It contrasts Israel's current area, about 25,000 square kilometers, with the ambition of this Greater Israel, 1.5 million square kilometers.
1.5 million. That's enormous. How big is that compared to, say, Iran?
It's almost exactly the size of Iran. Iran's about 1.6 million square kilometers. So this vision is for an Israel roughly the size of its current major regional adversary.
Okay. And what territories does this map supposedly include?
It's incredibly extensive. It reportedly includes all of current Israel, the Golan Heights, Gaza, but then it gets really expansive. Roughly half of Syria, about half of Iraq, all of Jordan.
All of Jordan?
All of Jordan, plus about a fifth of Egypt and roughly a third of Saudi Arabia. It basically redraws the entire map of the core Middle East.
That's hard to even comprehend. And what about population?
The goal mentioned is 150 million people. Compared to Israel's current population of just over 9 million, it implies unimaginable demographic shifts, likely involving mass displacement or subjugation.
And the source connects this alleged vision directly to figures like Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir.
It does. And the implication is chillingly clear. If this vision is real, if it's the actual goal, then, the source states, war will not stop. It won't just be short conflicts. It'll be fighting for decades until this dream is realized. It basically guarantees perpetual conflict.
That casts a very dark shadow over any talk of ceasefires or peace deals. Does the source see any evidence of this expansionism already happening? Any historical pattern?
Yes, it points to what it sees as a clear pattern. Every time Israel fights, its territory expands a little bit. Conflict is presented as the engine of expansion.
And it gives a recent example.
It does, the Golan Heights. The source suggests that following the recent conflict in Syria, the new leader there, Jilani, has essentially handed the Golan Heights over to Israel. Whether that's accurate is debatable, but the source presents it as a concrete example of how conflict leads to territorial gain, fitting this alleged larger pattern.
This leads us into a really broad and, again, very controversial theory the source presents about how Western powers operate in the Middle East. We need to tread carefully here, just reporting the source's view.
Absolutely. It's a deeply cynical take. The source argues that Western powers like the U.S., and by extension supporting Israel, don't actually prioritize things like democracy or secularism in Middle Eastern governments, not if those governments stand in the way of Western interests.
So what do they prioritize, according to this theory?
It boils down to whether a regime is willing to cooperate and, crucially, transfer interests, meaning give up land, resources, strategic advantages. The source uses the comparison between Assad and Jilani in Syria to make its point.
How does that comparison work?
Assad is described as secular, Western-educated. His wife wore Western clothes, but he protected Syria's territory, refused to give up the Golan Heights to Israel. Therefore, the source claims he was intolerable to the U.S. and Israel.
Okay. And Jilani?
Jilani, on the other hand, leads a religious regime. His wife wears a veil. He follows strict religious customs, much less secular. But the source alleges he's now tolerated because he did give up the Golan Heights, or is perceived as having done so.
So the ideology secular versus religious is less important than the willingness to concede territory or interests.
That's the core argument. It claims the defining factor for Western support isn't whether a regime is democratic or respects human rights, but whether it's pro-American and willing to make strategic concessions. The source dismisses the public emphasis on democracy, rule of law, freedom as just rhetoric, as something to fool idiots, in its very blunt phrasing, implying these values are just a cover for pursuing other, more tangible geopolitical and economic goals.
That is a profoundly cynical view of international relations.
It is, and it leads to a grim forecast. If that greater Israel vision is real, then the source predicts the Middle East won't see real, lasting peace. Only temporary truces, short breaks in the fighting, before the cycle of conflict and expansion starts again. It suggests the underlying blueprint ensures instability continues. Hashtag, tag, outro.
Wow. Okay, after going through all of that, it really feels like we've peeled back some complicated layers. We started with a ceasefire announcement, but what we've uncovered, according to the source material, is a situation just riddled with competing agendas, deep-seated ambitions, and, frankly, a lot of skepticism about real peace.
That really sums it up, doesn't it? The source paints a picture where, yes, a ceasefire might happen on the surface, but the underlying drivers, particularly the alleged expansionist goals attributed to figures like Netanyahu, make any peace feel incredibly fragile. The skepticism about it lasting is palpable throughout the analysis.
It seems the desire for peace might be there for some, maybe even many, but powerful agendas can just override that.
That's the tragic implication, that individual ambitions or grand geopolitical strategies, like this alleged greater Israel vision, can dictate events, regardless of the human cost or the broader wish for stability.
The source even mentioned Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, suggesting the world needs to act.
Yeah, Reverend Sachs arguing there's almost a global responsibility to stop Netanyahu, warning that letting these regional conflicts fester, especially with the nuclear undertones, risks global consequences. It's a very stark warning about interconnectedness.
So final thought for our listeners to chew on. What does peace even mean in a region where these kinds of historical narratives, alleged territorial ambitions, and complex geopolitical games are constantly being played?
Right. What would it actually take to break that cycle? To find a path to stability that goes beyond these temporary ceasefires and addresses the root causes, whatever they may truly be? This deep dive gave one perspective, one interpretation based on the material we looked at. But the questions linger, don't they? It's definitely something to keep thinking critically about.